Section 37, page 187. This lamp is smoking again. I should think the servants might see that it's kept properly trimmed, he grumbled nervously. I'm so sorry, it shan't happen again, she answered, in the firm, bright tone she had learned from her mother, and it exasperated Archer to feel that she was already beginning to humor him like a younger Mr. Welland. She bent over to lower the wick, and as the light struck upon her white shoulders and the clear curves of her face, he thought, how young she is! For what endless years this life will have to go on. He felt with a kind of horror his own strong youth and the bounding blood in his veins. Look here, he said suddenly. I might have to go to Washington for a few days, soon. Next week, perhaps. Her hand remained on the key of the lamp as she turned to him slowly. The heat from its flame had brought back a glow to her face, but it paled as she looked up. On business? She asked, in a tone which implied that there could be no other conceivable reason, and that she had put the question automatically, as if merely to finish his own sentence. On business, naturally. There is a patent case coming up before the Supreme Court. He gave the name of the inventor, and went on furnishing details with all Lawrence Lefferts's practiced glibness, while she listened attentively, saying at intervals, "Yes, I see." "The change will do you good," she said simply. When he had finished, "And you must be sure to go and see Ellen," she added, looking him straight in the eyes with her cloudless smile, and speaking in the tone she might have employed in urging him not to neglect some irksome family duty. It was the only word that passed between them on the subject, but in the code in which they had both been trained it meant, "Of course you understand that I know all the people have been saying about Ellen, and heartily sympathize with my family in their effort to get her to return to her husband. I also know that, for some reason, you have not chosen to tell me. You have advised her against this course, which all the older men of the family, as well as our grandmother, agree in approving, and that it is owing to your encouragement that Ellen defies us all, and exposes herself to the kind of criticism of which Mr. Slerton Jackson probably gave you this evening, the hint that has made you so irritable." "Hints have indeed not been wanting, but since you appear unwillingly to take them from others, I offer you this one myself, in the only form in which well-bred people of our kind can communicate unpleasant things to each other, by letting you understand that I know you mean to see Ellen when you're in Washington, and are perhaps going there expressly for that purpose, and that, since you are sure to see her, I wish you to do so with my full and explicit approval, and to take the opportunity of letting her know what the course of conduct you have encouraged her in is likely to lead to." Her hand was still on the key of the lamp when the last words of this mute message reached him. She turned the wick down, lifted off the globe, and breathed on the sulky flame. "They smell less if one blows them out," she explained, with her bright housekeeping air. On the threshold she turned and paused for his kiss. Chapter 27. Wall Street. The next day had more reassuring reports of Beaufort's situation. They weren't definite, but they were hopeful. It was generally understood that he could call on powerful influences in case of emergency, and that he had done so with success, and that evening, when Mrs. Beaufort appeared at the opera, wearing her old smile and a new emerald necklace, society drew a breath of relief. New York was so inexorable in its condemnation of business irregularities. So far, there had been no exception to its tacit rule that those who broke the law of probity must pay, and everyone was aware that even Beaufort and Beaufort's wife will be offered up unflinchingly to this principle. But to be obliged to offer them up wouldn't be only painful but inconvenient. The disappearance of the Beauforts would leave a considerable void in their compact little circle, and those who were too ignorant or too careless to shudder at the moral catastrophe bewailed in advance the loss of the best ballroom in New York. Archer had definitely made up his mind to go to Washington. He was waiting only for the opening of the lawsuit of which he had spoken to May, so that its date might coincide with that of his visit. But on the following Tuesday he learned from Mr. Letterblair that the case might be postponed for several weeks. Nevertheless, he went home that afternoon, determined in any event to leave the next evening. The chances were that May, who knew nothing of his professional life, and had never shown any interest in it, wouldn't learn of the postponement, should it take place, nor remember the names of the litigants if they were mentioned before her, and at any rate he couldn't longer put off seeing Madame Olenska. There were too many things to be that he must say to her. On the Wednesday morning, when he reached his office, Mr. Letterblair met him with a troubled face. Beaufort, after all, hadn't managed to tide over, but by setting afloat the rumor that he had done so, he had reassured his depositors, and heavy payments had poured into the bank till the previous evening, when disturbing reports again began to predominate. In consequence, a run on the bank had begun, and its doors were likely to close before the day was over. The ugliest things were being said of Beaufort's dastardly maneuver, and his failure promised to be one of the most discreditable in the history of Wall Street. The extent of the calamity left Mr. Letterblair white and incapacitated. "I've seen bad things in my time, but nothing as bad as this. Everybody we know will be hit, one way or another. And what will be done about Mrs. Beaufort? What can be done about her? I pity Mr. Manson Mingott as much as anybody. Coming at her age, there is no knowing what effect this affair may have on her. She always believed in Beaufort. She made a friend of him. And there is the whole Dallas connection. Poor Mrs. Beaufort is related to every one of you. Her only chance will be to leave her husband. Yet how can anyone tell her so? Her duty is at his side, and luckily she seems always to have been blind to his private weaknesses." There was a knock, and Mr. Letterblair turned his head sharply. "What is it? I can't be disturbed." A clerk brought in a letter for Archer and withdrew. Recognizing his wife's hand, the young man opened the envelope and read, "Won't you please come uptown as early as you can? Greenie had a slight stroke last night. In some mysterious way she found out before anyone else this awful news about the bank. Uncle Lovell is away shooting, and the idea of the disgrace had made poor Papa so nervous that he has a temperature and can't leave his room. Mama needs you dreadfully, and I do hope you can get away at once and go straight to Greenie's." Archer handed the note to his senior partner, and a few minutes later was crawling northward in a crowded horse car, which he exchanged at 14th Street for one of the high staggering omnibuses of the Fifth Avenue line. It was after 12 o'clock when this laborious vehicle dropped him at Old Catherine's. The sting-room window on the ground floor, where she usually throned, was tenanted by the inadequate figure of her daughter, Mrs. Welland, who signed a haggard welcome as she caught sight of Archer, and at the door he was met by the May. The hall wore the unnatural appearance peculiar to well-kept houses suddenly invaded by illness. Wraps and furs lay in heaps on the chairs. A doctor's bag and overcoat were on the table, and beside them letters and cards had already piled up unheeded. May looked pale but smiling. Dr. Bancombe, who had just come for the second time, took a more hopeful view, and Mrs. Mingott's dauntless determination to live and get well was already having an effect on her family. May led Archer into the old lady's sitting room, where the sliding doors opening into the bedroom had been drawn shut, and the heavy yellow damask portieres dropped over them. And here Mrs. Welland communicated to him in horrified undertones the details of the catastrophe. It appeared that the evening before something dreadful and mysterious had happened. At about 8 o'clock, just after Mrs. Mingott has finished the game of solitaire that she always played after dinner, the doorbell had rung, and a lady so thickly veiled that the servants didn't immediately recognize her had asked to be received. The butler, hearing a familiar voice, had thrown open the sitting-room door, announcing Mrs. Julius Beaufort, and had then closed it again on the two ladies. They must be in together, he thought, about an hour. When Mrs. Mingott's bell rang, Mrs. Beaufort had already slipped away unseen, and the old lady, white and vast and terrible, sat alone in her great chair, and signed to the butler to help her into her room. She seemed, at that time, though obviously distressed, in complete control of her body and brain. The mulatto maid put her to bed, brought her a cup of tea as usual, laid everything straight in the room, and went away. But at 3 in the morning, the bell rang again, and the two servants, hastening in at this unwanted summons, in parentheses, for old Catherine usually slept like a baby, had found their mistress sitting up against her pillow, with a crooked smile on her face, and one little hand hanging limp from its huge arm. The stroke had clearly been a slight one, for she was able to articulate and to make her wishes known, and soon after the doctor's visit, she had begun to regain control of her facial muscles. But the alarm had been great, and proportionately great was the indignation when it was gathered from Mrs. Mingott's fragmentary phrases that Regina Beaufort had come to ask her, incredibly effrontery, to back up her husband, see them through, not to desert them, as she called it, in fact to induce the whole family to cover and condone their monstrous dishonor. End of the section, page 190.